Alright guys, so the section we're going to cover after our factoring unit is 5.3, solving quadratic equations by factoring. The main reason we're starting with this unit is because it pretty much directly ties in with factoring. And once we get done with this section, you'll notice exactly what I'm talking about. So just as a warm-up, I want you guys to factor the following. Now these three are very stereotypical factoring problems that we're going to build on in this unit. So make sure you understand these and remember that you are responsible if you're not in class to do these on your own, so that way you know whether you got what it takes, so to speak, to do today's lesson. So just to reiterate, today we'll be solving quadratic equations by factoring. Now, if we're going to be solving quadratic equations, we need to know what quadratic equations are. A quadratic expression is just an expression that can be written in the form ax squared plus bx plus c, where a cannot be equal to 0. So what could it be? So what I'm pretty much trying to get at here is that your a, your b, and your c could be any number except for that a cannot be 0. So we could have something like this, 2x squared plus 3x plus 1. That is a quadratic expression because, again, it can be written in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. Your a in this situation is 1, your b is 3, and your c is a 1. So that's pretty much just what a quadratic equation. Now, we could also have other forms like 3x squared plus 2x. That's also a quadratic equation because, again, we can write it in this form. As long as the variable, the coefficient in front of x squared is not 0, you'll be fine. We can also have something like this, negative 5x squared. See, that is also a quadratic because I can write it in this form where a is not 0. Notice that b could be 0, c could be 0, and so forth. So this whole unit is about quadratics, and to be absolutely truthful, quadratics is one of these things that do not go away. You're going to be studying quadratics till you pretty much graduate, and especially if you decide to go into any STEM majors. So what we're doing today is pretty much figuring out how to solve equations that are in the quadratic form. Now, in order to solve those in the quadratic, or to solve these quadratics, there is a specific property that we're going to use in order to solve those, and it is called the zero property. And it's actually a very simple concept once you dive into it. So let's go into it. So for any real numbers a and b, if a times b equals 0, then that means that a has to equal 0, or b has to equal, or both. So just to reiterate, let's say you have any numbers or any expressions a and b. Let's say that we have a times b, and that is equal to 0. Remember that a could be 0 because if a equals 0, 0 times anything equals 0. B could also equal 0 because if we multiply that a times 0, anything times 0 is equal to 0. So where is this going to come in handy? We'll see in these examples here where we're going to apply the zero property for each problem. So if you notice number 1, I have something times something equal to 0. And of course, you're pretty much applying this concept, but it's a little more difficult. There's a lot more things going on. But the moral of the story is that you have something times something equal to 0. Whenever you have something times something equal to 0, that means that the somethings could be 0 or they both could be 0. So let's say that this one is 0. So I see that that's x minus 5. I'm going to set it equal to 0 to figure out what value makes that 0. If I add 5 to both sides, solving for x, these cancel out, and x is equal to a positive 5. So what would happen if I plug this into equation? Let me change colors here so that you can see it. I have here my x's. Let's plug in a 5 into this one right over here. If I have 5 minus 5, well, what's 5 minus 5? It's 0. So that means that this whole guy here equals 0. It doesn't matter what this is because anything times 0 equals 0. So that's pretty much the general idea of how to use the zero property. Now that ain't our only option that we could have equal to 0. Notice that we have something times something. The other something could also be 0. The something is 2x plus 1. So in order to solve for this x, we're pretty much figuring out what makes this 0. In order to figure that out, we're going to just solve for x, so minusing 1 on both sides. End up with 2x is equal to a negative 1. Dividing by 2 on both sides, x is equal to a negative 1 half. Make sure I write my negative to be clear. So what are my two answers? They would be 5 and negative 1 half. Because those are what makes either this guy 0 or this guy 0. So no matter what, you end up with a 0. So let's try the next one. Notice I have something times something equal to 0. My first something is 3x, so here is 3x equal to 0. I did that again in order to figure out what value of x makes it 0. Now let me stick my other something equal to 0. And you can solve these simultaneously. Not simultaneously, separately. Divide by 3, divide by 3. 0 divided by anything is 0, so that means that 0 is one of my answers. Add 3, and x equals a positive 3. So that's pretty much it. That's how you solve one of these equations. But always keep in the back of your guys' heads what you guys are solving here. Remember that this is 3 times x minus 3. You're looking for an x that makes this equation true. We use the 0 property to figure that out. If you plug 0 into this x and this x, you will get a 0 out. That is where the 0 property comes from. Now, that's cool and all, but what is that going to have to do with quadratics? How am I going to use the 0 property in order to solve quadratics? And let's go ahead and do this for the first problem here. All right, so starting from the beginning, I have 3 examples of how I'm going to solve quadratic equations by factoring. So in this first one, notice I have x squared minus 16x plus 64 equals 0. So it is my job to find a value for x that makes this equation true. Now, there might be 1, there might be 2, but it's my job to find that out. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, remember that it's pretty tough to just guess and check and figure out which one of these, or what value for x makes this equation 0. So what we're going to do here is apply a property. Notice that I first have a quadratic, and this is just a strategy on how you could solve quadratics. It's solving by factoring. Now, this is why we call it solving by factoring, because we have this equation here. It's a quadratic. It is equal to 0. What we could attempt to do is try to apply the 0 property. We have to have something times something equal to 0. Now, notice that in this specific situation, I don't have something times something. I have something squared minus 16x and so forth and so forth. But we know how to make that something times something, aka we're going to factor it. So how in the world would I factor that? There's no greatest common factor I could take out. So it's a trinomial. I'm going to try to factor it to 2 binomials. The first 2 terms are going to multiply to x squared. Now, remember, this is a simple trinomial. So what multiplies to 64, but it adds up to a negative 16? Well, let's just start with 64. What are things that multiply to 64? I believe 8 and 8. And I can clearly see right away that both of these add up to 16. So I'm going to make them both negative, so that way they add up to a negative 16. So you end up with a negative 8 and a negative 8. Now, remember that factoring is key here. If you know how to factor, you're going to get something times something. If you have something times something equal to 0, you now have the 0 property. So that's why we kind of covered the 0 property first. And that's why we covered factoring all last unit to pretty much get to be able to solve quadratics. So I have something times something equals 0. Here's one of my somethings. Here is my second something. Now notice that these are the exact same things, so there's no need to solve both of them. You only need one. So let's add 8 to both sides, and x is equal to a positive 8. Plug 8 into this equation, and you'll notice that when you solve the left side, it's going to be equal to 0. All right, very next one. I forgot to type out a 0 there, so let's just pretend it was there. So it is my job again to notice that this is a quadratic. Now it's my job to figure out how I'm going to solve it. How in the world am I going to figure out an x that makes this equation true? Now remember, the only strategy that we've covered so far is to solve by factoring. So we need to solve by factoring in order to be able to use the 0 property. Now, in order to use 0 property, it has to be equal to 0. Is this equal to 0? Yes. Do we have something times something? No. So it's our job to figure that out. So let's start with the greatest common factor. What's the greatest common factor that I can take out of these 2 terms? And the answer would be 2. You'll be left with an x squared minus 25, and that's all equal to 0. Now, we're not done yet because remember, you have to factor completely. You'll notice that that is a difference of perfect squares. So what times itself multiplies to x squared? The answer would be x and x. We'll multiply itself to 25. It'll be 5, make one plus, make one minus. Don't forget your 2 out in front, and that is still all equal to 0. So 0 property works for 2 things are multiplying together, 3 things, 4 things. It doesn't really matter. You just have to have multiple, more than one thing multiplying. So we have something times something equal to 0. All the somethings could be 0. So let's start with the first one. 2 is equal to 0. Notice that there's nothing to even solve for. So you can just ignore it if you ever get to that situation. The second something is an x plus 5 equals 0. Now that does have a variable, so let's go ahead and solve for it. So x is equal to a negative 5. Let's set our other something equal to 0 and solve for that. Adding 5 to both sides, you end up with x is equal to a positive 5. So what are the solutions to this this quadratic? It would be x equals a -5 and a +5. Plug it into that equation, you'll notice that you get a 0 out. Now I'm going to erase all this stuff, so if you want to copy down, if I was going too fast, press pause before I do the last example. All right, so I can see here that I have a quadratic. There's only one strategy that I know so far in order how to solve quadratic formulas or quadratic equations, and that would be by factoring, aka the zero property. So my first goal should be setting it equal to 0, because again, you have to use the 0 property. Now it's equal to 0, so I need to figure out, hey, on the left side, do I have something times something? And the answer would be no. So it's my job to factor. Now notice that this thing is a little misplaced, because remember, whenever I'm factoring, I always want it in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. I want my x squared term first, followed by my x term, and followed by my constant. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to flip these guys around, so that way I can factor a little bit easier. And now let's go ahead and factor our lives away. Now there's no greatest common factor, but that is a trinomial. What times what multiplies to x squared? That answer would just be an x. 1 multiplies to 36, but adds up to 12, and that would be a +6. Now I have something times something equal to 0, so I'm going to set one of the somethings equal to 0. If I set the second something equal to 0, notice it's the same thing, so I'm not going to have to do it twice. I'm just going to do it once. So that looks a little bit messy. Let me redo that. So I have x minus 6 equals 0, minusing 6 on both sides, x is equal to a -6. And that's it. Plug in -6 into this equation, and you'll notice that you'll get a 0 out. All right, so let's solve the last 2 sets of problems, and then we will call it notes after that. So while this is taking a picture going from there, remember that whenever you guys see a quadratic, and it's your job to solve a quadratic, just like we have here. We have x squared is equal to 6x. It's your job to solve for this. Figure out an x that makes this equation true. One way to do it, and the only way we've learned so far, is by factoring, aka using the 0 property. Now, is this even equal to 0? And the answer would be no. So what I'm going to do is make it equal to 0. I'm going to choose to move one side, either move the x squared over here or move the 6x over there. I'm going to try to get it equal to 0. Now, which one do I move depends on your x squared term. Notice that this x squared term has a coefficient of 1. It is positive. You always want that x squared term positive. So that's going to tell me to move that 6x over. I'm going to do it by doing the opposite. You're going to be left with x squared minus 6x is equal to 0. Now again, you are using the 0 property. That's why we set it equal to 0. Now we have to factor the left side. Start with the greatest common factor, which in this situation is an x. You're going to be left with x minus 0, which is equal to 0. X times x minus 6 is all equal to 0, is what I meant to say. Now I have something times something equal to 0. Let's set the first something equal to 0. So that means that x equals 0. That's cool, because that's an answer. We're okay. We have a variable. We solve for it. Then we have x minus 6 is equal to 0. Adding 6 to both sides, you end up with x is equal to 6. Plug it into both these equations, and you'll see it works out. For instance, let's try the 0 first. 0 squared is equal to 6 times 0. 0 squared is 0. 6 times 0 is 0. Checks out. Let's try the 6. 6 squared plus 6 times 6. 6 squared is 36, and 6 times 6 is 36. Checks out. So one more, I'll change colors so that way we don't get too confused. So I have it 6x squared is equal to 1 minus x. Now remember, your whole goal here is to set it pretty much equal to 0, so that way you can factor it, so that way you can use the 0 property. Now my x squared term is positive, so I'm going to move everything over to the opposite side. I'm going to add x to one side. End up with 6x squared plus x is equal to a positive 1. Now moving that 1 over, I end up with 6x squared plus x minus 1 is equal to 0. I finally have it equal to 0. Keep in mind that I put my x squared term first, followed by my x, and followed by my constant, so that way I can get ready to factor. Now there's no greatest common factor, but this is a trinomial, so I'm going to set my two binomials up. What are things that multiply to 6? I think it would be 3 and 2 and 6 and 1. What are things that multiply to 1? It's just 1 and 1. So let's try to figure out which one of these work. I'm going to start with the closest ones, or the numbers are closer together, because for some reason it always seems to work. Let's do the 1 and the 1. The insides multiply to 2x, the outsides multiply to 3x. So I can see there that, yes, these actually subtract to 1. So I actually found my factors. Now, which one should I make negative? I'm going to make my bottom one negative because I need to add up to a positive 1x. So if my negative 2 needs to be negative, what are the things that multiply? It would be the insides that give me that negative 2x, and the outsides would be a positive. So erasing this, because this really doesn't have to do work, it just helps us. I have something times something equal to 0. Let's set the somethings equal to 0 and solve for it. Now, that way I can have a little space, I'm going to do it in this little corner. My first something is 3x minus 1 is equal to 0. Solving for that, I'm going to add 1 to both sides. I'm going to end up with 3x is equal to 1. Divide by 3 on both sides, x is equal to 1/3. That's a 1/3, by the way. Let me write it a little nicer. There we go, a little better. Let's go ahead and do that for our last term. I'll do this in yellow so that way you can see it. I have my second 2x plus 1 is equal to 0. Solving for this, I'm going to minus 1 on both sides. You end up with 2x is equal to a negative 1. Divide by 2 on both sides. That's a 2, by the way. X is equal to a negative 1/2. And that's it. That is how you solve by factoring. My general idea would be that if you're solving, or if you have a quadratic, you solve it by factoring for now. In order to solve it by factoring, you need to have it equal to 0 because you need to be able to use the 0 property.